Picture this: Turin, Italy, 2003. A man stands on the balcony of his family's historic palazzo, looking out over the city his grandfather built into an industrial empire. He's worth billions. He controls one of the most powerful companies in Europe. He has everything money can buy, and in just a few years, he'll be gone, destroyed not by his enemies, but by the very legacy he was born to protect. This is the story of Giovanni Agnelli, the last king of Fiat, and how the weight of an empire crushed the man who wore its crown, born into an empire. Giovanni Alberto Agnelli was born on April 19th, 1964, into a world most people can only imagine. The Agnelli family wasn't just wealthy. They were Italian royalty without the title, the closest thing the country had to an American dynasty like the Kennedys or Rockefellers. His great-great-grandfather, Giovanni Agnelli, had founded Fiat in 1899, transforming it from a small automobile manufacturer into a symbol of Italian pride and industrial might. His uncle Gianni, known to everyone as L'Avvocato, controlled the empire with a style that made him a legend. By the time little Giovanni Alberto came into the world, the family didn't just make cars. They shaped the destiny of an entire nation. But being born into paradise came with a price that would take decades to fully reveal itself. The boy grew up in a gilded cage. While other children played in parks, Giovanni Alberto wandered through Renaissance palaces. While other kids rode bicycles, he was driven in Ferraris and Maseratis. The family owned more than just companies. They owned newspapers, soccer teams, entire towns where Fiat workers lived and breathed the Agnelli name. Young Giovanni was groomed from birth to one day take control of it all, to become the next guardian of a legacy that employed hundreds of thousands of Italians and represented the country's economic backbone. His childhood unfolded across multiple continents. The family maintained residences in Turin, Rome, Paris, New York, and St. Moritz. Giovanni Alberto learned to ski in the Swiss Alps before most children learned to ride a bike. He spoke multiple languages before he was 10. He attended the finest schools, surrounded by the children of diplomats, aristocrats, and fellow industrial titans. On paper, it looked like a fairy tale. But fairy tales rarely mention the pressure, the expectations, the constant awareness that you're not just yourself, but a symbol of something much larger and far more demanding. The Agnelli family operated under a code as rigid as any royal house. Public behavior was scrutinized. Every word mattered. Every photograph told a story that needed to align with the family's carefully constructed image. Gianni, the patriarch, was known throughout Italy as L'Avvocato, the lawyer, though he'd barely practiced law. What he practiced was power, and he did it with a style that made him a legend. He wore his watch over his shirt cuff. He spoke in measured tones that made politicians nervous. When he walked into a room, Italy's future often walked in with him. This was the man Giovanni Alberto needed to live up to, and the comparison started before he could even understand what it meant: the family curse. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn, one that would cast a shadow over everything that followed. Giovanni Alberto's father was Umberto Agnelli, Gianni's younger brother, a capable industrialist who'd served as Fiat's CEO in the 1970s. Umberto understood the business, understood the pressure, understood what it meant to carry the family name. He'd married Antonella Becci Piaggio, herself from the famous Piaggio family that created the Vespa scooter. Giovanni Alberto was born into not just one industrial dynasty, but two, with manufacturing heritage running through both sides of his bloodline. But the Agnelli family carried a darkness that no amount of wealth could illuminate. Tragedy had stalked them for generations. Gianni's own father had died in a plane crash in 1935. His mother died in a car accident in 1945. Death seemed to circle the family like a patient predator, striking without warning, without mercy, without regard for power or position. And then there was Eduardo, Gianni's only son, Giovanni Alberto's cousin. Born in 1954, Eduardo should have been the obvious heir, the direct line from father to son that would carry fiat into the next generation. But Eduardo never wanted the crown. While Gianni built industrial empires and played chess with prime ministers, Eduardo wanted something simpler, something more real. He studied Oriental literature and philosophy at Princeton. He traveled to the East, searching for spiritual meaning in places far removed from boardrooms and balance sheets. He converted to Islam, taking the name Mahdi. He rejected the polished Agnelli image that his father had perfected. The conflict between Gianni and Eduardo became one of those open secrets that everyone in Italy knew, but nobody quite discussed. Here was the most powerful industrialist in the country, a man who could bend markets and influence governments, and he couldn't convince his own son to follow in his footsteps. Eventually, Gianni gave up trying to groom Eduardo for leadership, recognizing that forcing the issue would destroy them both, which meant the succession had to skip a generation, which meant Giovanni Alberto, nephew rather than son, would have to carry the burden his cousin Eduardo had refused. Giovanni Alberto seemed different from his troubled cousin. Where Eduardo rebelled, Giovanni appeared to embrace his destiny. When his parents divorced in 1974, he moved with his mother to the United States, attending the McCallie School in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Later, he enrolled at Brown University in Rhode Island, graduating in 1986 with a degree in international relations. His thesis focused on the Middle East, demonstrating the kind of global perspective that would be essential for leading a multinational corporation. After graduation, he returned to Italy, determined to learn the family business from the ground up. He didn't just want to inherit an empire. He wanted to earn the right to lead it. At 18, he'd already worked on a Fiat production line under the false name Giovannino Rossi, hiding his identity so he could understand the reality of manufacturing without the deference that came with his surname. He worked in different departments, learning manufacturing, learning finance, learning how to manage the thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on decisions made in wood-paneled conference rooms. Those who worked with him during these years remember a young man who took his responsibilities seriously. He wasn't the playboy some expected a billionaire heir to be. He asked questions. He listened. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding not just how to run the company, but how to make it better, how to navigate the changing automotive landscape where Japanese manufacturers were eating into European market share and new technologies demanded new thinking. In 1987, Giovanni Alberto joined Piaggio, the scooter manufacturer connected to his mother's family. This wasn't a ceremonial position. He worked as assistant to the president, learning the business from experienced managers who didn't coddle him because of his name. 6 years later, in February 1993, at just 28 years old, he was appointed president of Piaggio. The company was struggling, losing ground to competitors, hemorrhaging money. Giovanni saw it as his chance to prove himself, and prove himself he did. Within a year, he'd transformed Piaggio into the leading scooter producer in Europe and the fourth largest globally. He modernized production facilities. He invested in new technologies. He championed employee training programs. He pushed for a company museum that would honor not just the brand, but the workers who built it. He believed, genuinely and passionately, that people were the heart of any successful enterprise. His approach was described as enlightened, progressive, focused on creating value for all stakeholders, rather than just maximizing profits for shareholders. On November 15th, 1993, Giovanni Alberto joined the board of directors of Fiat itself. The Italian press loved the story. Here was the new generation, handsome and educated, ready to lead Fiat into the 21st century. Magazine covers showed him in expensive suits, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expression serious and determined. He looked the part. He sounded the part. In the summer of 1995, Gianni Agnelli made it official, publicly announcing that Giovanni Alberto was his chosen successor, the future chairman of Fiat. The announcement sent a clear message. The succession crisis was solved. The family had found its next leader. Giovanni Alberto was 31 years old, energetic, capable, with a track record of success at Piaggio. He represented hope, continuity, the promise that the Agnelli dynasty would endure for another generation, the invisible enemy. But even as the headlines celebrated his ascension, something was wrong. Something was happening inside Giovanni's body that would change everything. He started experiencing strange symptoms in late 1996 and early 1997. Fatigue that sleep couldn't cure. Difficulty concentrating despite his sharp intellect. Physical discomfort that doctors struggled to explain. At first, the consensus pointed to stress, to the pressure of his position, to the psychological weight of carrying the Agnelli name. Rest more, they told him. Take vacations. Learn to delegate. The advice was well-meaning, but ultimately useless because it misunderstood what was actually happening. In March 1997, doctors discovered what had been attacking him from within, a rare and aggressive form of stomach cancer. The following month, in April 1997, Giovanni Alberto did something that shocked Italy. He called a press conference and announced his diagnosis. He was 33 years old. He stood before the cameras and the journalists and told them he was undergoing treatment. The optimism in his voice couldn't quite mask the reality that everyone could see in his eyes. He sought treatment at specialized centers in the United States, flying between Italy and America as he balanced his fight for survival with his responsibilities at Piaggio and Fiat. The treatments were brutal. Chemotherapy that turned his skin grey and his strong frame gaunt. Surgeries that bought time but couldn't promise a cure. Through it all, he tried to maintain his duties, attending board meetings when he was strong enough, reviewing documents when he wasn't. The Italian public watched the drama unfold with growing horror over those 9 months. Here was their prince, the heir to their industrial crown, wasting away before their eyes. Newspapers tracked his decline with the attention they'd give to a dying monarch. Every public appearance became an opportunity to speculate about his condition. Every photograph was analyzed for signs of deterioration or hope, love and loss. But Giovanni refused to surrender entirely to his illness. He'd already married Avery Howe in 1996, an Anglo-American architect he'd met during his time at Brown University. The wedding had been everything you'd expect from Italian aristocracy, a beautiful ceremony that merged old-world tradition with modern glamour. Friends and family celebrated what seemed like the beginning of a new chapter. Now, facing his diagnosis just months later, that marriage took on a different meaning. Avery stood by him through the treatments, through the pain, through the growing certainty that time was running out. The marriage gave him something to fight for, beyond duty and legacy. In September 1997, just months after his diagnosis, Avery gave birth to their daughter, Virginia Asia Agnelli. Giovanni held his child, knowing what the doctors had told him, knowing that time was running out, knowing that he'd likely never see her grow up. The photographs from those days show a man caught between joy and grief. celebrating new life while facing his own death. The treatments bought him some time, some moments of relative stability, where he could pretend that maybe the doctors were wrong, maybe he'd beat the odds. But cancer doesn't negotiate, and the rare form attacking Giovanni was particularly aggressive. One of his final public appearances came on December 9th, 1997, just 4 days before his death. Despite his condition, despite the pain that was now constant, he attended a Juventus UEFA Champions League match against Manchester United. Juventus, the soccer team his family owned and that he loved with genuine passion, won 1-0. The footage from that night shows Giovanni in the stands, trying to smile, trying to enjoy the moment, but the pain is visible on his face for anyone who knows to look for it. The end. On December 13th, 1997, Giovanni Alberto Agnelli died at his home near Turin. He was 33 years old. He died not from recklessness or self-destruction, but from a disease that struck randomly and killed efficiently. He died with his potential unrealized, his promise unfulfilled, his destiny stolen by biological chance rather than character flaw or personal choice. The funeral was held at dawn, at 7 a.m., in the family tomb at Villar Perosa, outside Turin. The timing reflected how Giovanni had lived, shunning the spotlight, preferring dignity over spectacle. Thousands lined the streets anyway. Politicians, business leaders, and ordinary Italians who worked in Fiat factories came to pay their respects. They weren't just mourning a young man who'd passed too soon. They were mourning the future they thought they'd have, the stability they thought was guaranteed, the continuity that Giovanni had represented. Gianni Agnelli stood at the funeral, looking older than his years, a man who'd survived world wars and economic crises and political upheaval, now brought low by the loss of his nephew and chosen heir. In Giovanni Alberto, he'd seen his own legacy secured. Now he was back to uncertainty, forced to confront the question of succession all over again at an age when he should have been enjoying retirement. The cascade begins. But here's what makes this story truly devastating, what transforms it from merely sad to genuinely tragic. Giovanni Alberto's death didn't just end his own potential. It triggered a cascade of consequences that would eventually threaten the entire Agnelli empire. With Giovanni Alberto gone, the succession became murky. John Elkann, Gianni's grandson through his daughter Margherita, was just 21 years old, barely out of university, completely unprepared to take on leadership of one of Europe's largest industrial conglomerates. Gianni's other grandson, Lapo Elkann, was even younger and, as would later become clear, struggling with personal issues that made him unsuitable for leadership. The power vacuum created chaos. Fiat itself was struggling. The company faced increasing competition from Asian manufacturers who could produce cars more cheaply. Design had stagnated. Innovation had slowed. Market share was eroding in key segments. What Fiat needed was bold, visionary leadership. What it got instead was uncertainty and internal power struggles as various factions within the company and the family jockeyed for position. Gianni, despite his age and declining health, was forced to remain in control far longer than he'd planned. He appointed his brother Umberto, Giovanni Alberto's father, as chairman in 1997. But Umberto was already in his 60s and would himself die from lung cancer in 2004. The careful succession planning that had centered on Giovanni Alberto was in ruins. And then came another blow that nearly broke Gianni completely. On November 15th, 2000, 3 years after Giovanni Alberto's death, Edoardo Agnelli's body was found beneath a highway bridge outside Turin. His car was parked on the viaduct above, engine still running. He was 46 years old. The official determination suggested he'd taken his own life, though questions and inconsistencies would haunt the family for years. Giovanni, who'd already buried one heir, now buried his only son. The man who'd controlled billions, who'd influenced governments, who'd shaped Italy's industrial destiny, couldn't save the people he loved most. The grief must have been unbearable. In January 2003, Giovanni himself passed away at the age of 81, succumbing to prostate cancer he'd been fighting for years. His death marked the end of an era, the closing of the chapter where the Agnelli name alone could move markets and influence governments. He died knowing that the dynasty he'd built was vulnerable, that the succession he'd planned so carefully had fallen apart, that the future was uncertain in ways it hadn't been when Giovanni Alberto was alive. What followed was a period of intense turbulence for Fiat. The company nearly collapsed in the mid-2000s, saved only through a complicated series of restructurings, partnerships, and eventually a merger with Chrysler that created Fiat Chrysler Automobiles. John Elkann, thrust into leadership responsibilities before he was ready, had to navigate crises that would have challenged executives with decades more experience. The question haunted everyone involved. Would things have been different if Giovanni Alberto had lived? Would his leadership have prevented Fiat's near-death experience? Would his vision have modernized the company before the problems became critical? Would the Agnelli empire have remained intact and dominant instead of being forced into a defensive crouch? We can't know the answers, but the questions themselves reveal the magnitude of what was lost when Giovanni died at 33. Giovanni Alberto's life tells the story of a man who approached his destiny with seriousness and dedication. He didn't rebel like his cousin Eduardo. He didn't chase hedonistic pleasures or squander the family fortune. He proved himself at Piaggio, transforming a struggling company into a market leader. He married, had a child, built the foundation for a life that should have stretched decades into the future. By every reasonable measure, he was exactly what the Agnelli family needed, and none of it mattered. The cruel irony is that if Giovanni had been born into a different family, his death would have been a private tragedy, mourned by those who loved him, but not carrying implications that stretched across an entire industry. But he wasn't born into a different family. He was born an Agnelli, and that meant his death became a historical inflection point, the moment when one of Italy's greatest industrial dynasties lost its clear path forward. His wife, Avery, was left a widow before she'd barely begun married life, with a newborn daughter who would never know her father. She eventually returned to the United States, carrying memories of a love story that ended before its middle chapters could be written. The life she'd imagined, the future she'd planned, vanished as completely as Giovanni's own dreams of leading Fiat into a new era. The Agnelli family continued, of course. Families like theirs don't disappear just because one heir passes young. John Elkann grew into his role, surprising skeptics by proving to be a capable leader who helped navigate Fiat through its darkest period. The company survived, transformed, adapted to new realities. The dynasty didn't end, but it was never quite the same. Giovanni Alberto was supposed to be the bridge between Gianni's era and whatever came next. When that bridge collapsed, the family had to ford the river instead of crossing it safely, and they emerged on the other side, battered, less certain of their own permanence. Today, when automotive historians discuss Fiat's struggles in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Giovanni Alberto's passing appears as a footnote, a tragic personal story that happened to coincide with broader industry trends. But those who understand the importance of leadership and succession planning know it was more than a footnote. It was a catalyst, an accelerant that turned manageable problems into existential crises. What's particularly haunting about Giovanni's story is how much preparation went into a future that never arrived. From the moment he was born, resources were dedicated to shaping him into the perfect leader. The best schools, the best mentors, the best opportunities to learn every aspect of the business. His entire childhood and young adulthood were structured around a single goal, preparing him to take the helm of the Agnelli Empire when the time came. And then, suddenly, all that preparation became meaningless. All those years of grooming, all those sacrifices, all those carefully laid plans evaporated in the space of a few months as cancer consumed him from within. The people who worked with Giovanni during his final years at Piaggio and Fiat speak about his determination with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Even as his body failed, even as the treatments left him weakened and sick, he kept trying to fulfill his duties. He attended meetings when he could barely stand. He reviewed reports when his eyes could hardly focus. He was trying, desperately, to be the leader he'd been raised to be, even as it became increasingly clear that time had run out. There's something noble about that determination, but there's also something heartbreaking about it. Giovanni was fighting two battles simultaneously, one against the cancer in his body, and one against the expectations that had defined his entire existence. He couldn't win either battle, but he refused to surrender to both. The business community in Italy watched all of this unfold with growing concern. Fiat wasn't just another company. It was a cornerstone of the Italian economy, a source of national pride, an employer of hundreds of thousands. The uncertainty about its leadership succession wasn't just a private family matter. It had implications for workers, suppliers, dealers, investors, and the broader Italian business landscape. When Giovanni passed in December 1997, the immediate question everyone asked was, what happens now? Gianni was approaching 80, dealing with his own health issues. There was no obvious successor ready to step in. The careful succession planning that had centered on Giovanni Alberto was in ruins. The company faced a leadership crisis at precisely the moment when the automotive industry was entering a period of rapid change and fierce global competition. In some ways, Fiat never fully recovered from this crisis. The company that Giovanni Alberto was supposed to lead into the 21st century ended up struggling through the first decade of that century, losing market share, burning through cash, and eventually needing to merge with an American competitor to survive. The Agnelli family's response to Giovanni's passing reflected their aristocratic training. They grieved privately. They maintained their public composure. They dealt with the practical matters of succession and corporate governance without allowing the public to see too much of their internal struggles. It was classic Agnelli behavior. Present a unified, controlled front to the world, no matter what chaos might be happening behind closed doors. But those who knew the family well could see the cracks. Gianni, the patriarch who'd always seemed invincible, looked diminished. The certainty that had always characterized the Agnelli approach to business and life had been replaced by something more tentative, more fragile. The Italian public's reaction to Giovanni's death was surprisingly emotional. Thousands of people who'd never met him, who had no direct connection to the Agnelli family or to Fiat, felt genuine grief at his passing. Part of this was because Italians had been following his story through the media, watching him rise through the company ranks, celebrating his marriage, watching with horror as his health deteriorated. He'd become a public figure whose life played out in the pages of newspapers and magazines. But there was something deeper at work, too. Giovanni represented a certain kind of Italian ideal. The responsible heir who honored his family's legacy. The educated leader who understood both tradition and modernity. The young man who seemed to embody the best qualities of his generation. When he passed, it felt like Italy was losing not just a person, but a symbol of hope for the future. The timing of Giovanni's death made it particularly cruel. He passed in December, during the holiday season, when families gather and celebrate. Instead of joy and togetherness, the Agnelli family faced grief and loss. Instead of looking forward to the new year with optimism, they faced an uncertain future without the man they'd expected would lead them through it. His daughter, Virginia Asia, would grow up knowing her father only through photographs and stories, through the memories others shared and the legacy he left behind. She was just 3 months old when he died, too young to remember his face or his voice or the way he held her. She inherited his bloodline, his name, his position in one of Italy's most powerful families. But she never got to know the man himself. There's a museum at Piaggio now, opened in 2001, 4 years after Giovanni's death. He'd envisioned it during his presidency, wanting to create a space that celebrated not just the products, but the workers who made them, the community that sustained the company. It bears his name, the Museo Piaggio, and stands as a monument to his brief but impactful leadership. Visitors can see the scooters and motorcycles, but they can also learn about the people behind them, exactly as Giovanni had intended. The legacy. Giovanni Alberto Agnelli didn't destroy himself through hubris or recklessness or moral failure. He was destroyed by the same random cruelty that strikes thousands of people every year. People whose passings don't make headlines because they weren't born into dynasties. The difference is that when Giovanni passed, his unfulfilled potential represented more than just personal loss. It represented an alternate timeline where one of Europe's most important companies might have navigated the 21st century very differently. His grave in Villa Perosa stands as a monument not just to his life, but to all the lives he might have lived, all the decisions he might have made, all the changes he might have implemented, all the futures that died with him on that December day in 1997. In the pantheon of tragic figures in business history, Giovanni holds a unique place. He wasn't brought down by scandal or incompetence. He wasn't destroyed by rivals or market forces. He wasn't undone by his own character flaws or bad decisions. He was simply unlucky, struck by a disease at exactly the wrong moment in his life and in his family's history. The years following his death saw Fiat struggle in ways that perhaps vindicate those who wonder what might have been. Under the leadership of professional managers, the company faced crisis after crisis. By 2002, Fiat had taken out a €3 billion loan it couldn't pay back. The company that had once represented Italian industrial supremacy was on the verge of bankruptcy, facing the prospect of being taken over by its creditor banks. The dynasty endures. Giovanni's father, Umberto, took over as chairman after Gianni's death in 2003, but he was already battling lung cancer. He died in May 2004, just 15 months after his brother, adding another layer of tragedy to a family that seemed cursed by premature death. With both Gianni and Umberto gone, and with Giovanni Alberto having died 7 years earlier, the family faced its greatest leadership crisis in history. John Elkann, thrust into prominence at an age when most people are still figuring out their careers, had to mature quickly. He became vice chairman of Fiat in 2004 at just 28 years old, the same age Giovanni Alberto had been when he took over Piaggio. But unlike Giovanni, who'd had years to learn the business and prove himself, John was learning on the job during a period of existential crisis. To his credit, John proved more capable than many expected. He brought in Sergio Marchionne as CEO, a hard-driving executive who would eventually orchestrate Fiat's survival through the merger with Chrysler. But those early years were touch and go, with the company's survival genuinely in doubt. analysts openly questioned whether the Agnelli family would maintain control or whether Fiat would be broken up and sold off in pieces. Industry insiders who knew Giovanni and watched the crisis unfold often speak in hypotheticals. Would Giovanni have been bold enough to pursue the Chrysler merger? Would he have pushed for radical restructuring? Would his relationships with Italian unions have smoothed difficult transitions? The questions persist because the gap between expectation and reality was so vast. The accumulated grief the family endured was extraordinary. Gianni watched 3 potential heirs die before his own death. His father in 1935, Giovanni Alberto in 1997, and Edoardo in 2000. For the workers at Fiat and Piaggio, Giovanni's death represented the loss of a different kind of leader. His speeches and writings emphasized the human element of business, the idea that companies existed not just to generate profits, but to create value for everyone involved. He talked about workers as the true source of strength, about teamwork and shared objectives. In an era of increasing globalization and cost-cutting, his approach seemed almost quaint, a throwback to a more paternalistic time. But those who worked under him at Piaggio saw the results of that philosophy. The company turned around not just financially, but culturally. Morale improved. Innovation flourished. Workers felt invested in the company's success because they felt the company was invested in them. When Giovanni died, union leaders mourned him genuinely, not out of obligation, but because they recognized they'd lost an ally in the executive suite. The question of what happens to industrial dynasties in the modern world loomed large over Giovanni's funeral and continues to hover over the Agnelli family today. The old model, where a family could control a major corporation for generations through direct management, was already under strain in the 1990s. Professional managers with MBAs and global experience were increasingly seen as necessary for competing in international markets. Family control through holding companies and strategic board positions became the norm rather than direct operational leadership. Giovanni Alberto represented an attempt to square this circle, to combine family heritage with professional competence. He had the education, the work ethic, the demonstrated ability. He could have been both an Agnelli and a modern CEO. His death meant the family had to choose: find another family member who could navigate this balance, or surrender operational control to professional managers while maintaining ownership through financial structures. They chose the latter, which has worked after a fashion. The Agnelli family still controls Exor, the holding company that owns stakes in Ferrari, Stellantis, and various other enterprises. John Elkann chairs these companies, but relies heavily on professional CEOs to run them. It's a different model than the one Gianni embodied, where he was both owner and operator, both dynasty head and active manager. Would Giovanni Alberto have followed Gianni's model, or embraced the more modern separation of ownership and management? His time at Piaggio suggests he would have remained actively involved in operations, unwilling to be just a figurehead. But we'll never know because he never got the chance to show us. The medical community has made tremendous strides in treating gastric cancer since 1997, though it remains one of the more challenging cancers to treat successfully. If Giovanni were diagnosed today, his chances would be better, though far from certain. It's one of those cruel ironies that medicine often advances just after it's needed, that the treatments that might have saved him became available just years after his death. His daughter, Virginia Asia, grew up in the shadow of a father she never knew, carrying a name that opened doors and created expectations in equal measure. She inherited wealth and position, but missed out on the guidance and love that no amount of money can replace. Family members and friends who knew Giovanni speak to her about him, keeping his memory alive through stories and photographs. But it's not the same as having him there. Avery Howe, his widow, chose to step away from the intense spotlight of the Agnelli world. She returned to her own life, her own career, eventually moving forward in the way that widows must when they're still young enough to have decades ahead of them. The Italian press respected her privacy in a way they hadn't always respected Giovanni's, perhaps recognizing that she'd already endured enough. The Juventus soccer team, which Giovanni loved and briefly served as president, dedicated its 1997 season to his memory. Players wore black armbands. Fans held moments of silence. The club, which had won the Champions League in 1996 under his presidency, reached the final again in 1997 and 1998, though they lost both times. Those teams represented the last gasp of Juventus dominance before the club entered a period of transition that mirrored Fiat's own struggles. In Turin, the city most associated with both Fiat and the Agnelli family, Giovanni's death was felt personally by thousands who'd never met him. Turin's economy revolved around Fiat. When the company struggled in the 2000s, the city struggled with it. Unemployment rose. Young people left for opportunities elsewhere. The confidence and prosperity that had characterized the Fiat era began to fade. Whether Giovanni could have prevented this decline is unknowable, but his absence meant there was no one to even try. The broader lesson, if there is one, might be about the fragility of succession planning in family businesses. No matter how carefully you prepare, no matter how thoroughly you groom an heir, no matter how perfectly they seem suited for the role, biology and chance can upend everything in an instant. Smart families have backup plans and contingencies, but even those can prove inadequate when tragedy strikes repeatedly. The Agnelli family's story is exceptional in its scale and visibility, but the underlying dynamic plays out in family businesses worldwide. The second generation that can't or won't take over. The third generation thrust into leadership before they're ready. The talented heir taken too soon. These are universal themes in family enterprise, and they rarely have happy endings. Giovanni Alberto's legacy exists in fragments now. The museum at Piaggio that bears his vision. The memories of people who worked with him and saw his potential. The what-ifs that business historians debate when discussing Fiat's trajectory. The genetic inheritance passed down to his daughter. The cautionary tale about making succession planning contingent on a single individual, no matter how capable they seem. That kind of tragedy lacks the moral clarity of a cautionary tale. It offers no lessons about hubris or excess. It just is, as senseless and cruel as the disease that caused it. And perhaps that's what makes it so haunting. We want our tragedies to mean something, to teach us something, to offer some wisdom that might help us avoid similar fates. But Giovanni's story offers no such comfort. It simply reminds us that sometimes the universe remains indifferent to our plans, our preparations, and our destinies. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. November 29th, 1981. A yacht named Splendor floats in the dark waters off Catalina Island. On board, one of Hollywood's most beloved stars, her husband, and a leading man who would become central to one of entertainment's most haunting mysteries. By morning, Natalie Wood would be gone, and the questions surrounding that Thanksgiving weekend would echo through the decades, growing louder with each passing year. Segment 11. The Star. The name Natalie Wood conjures images that defined American cinema. A little girl believing in Santa Claus in Miracle on 34th Street. A restless teenager in a red jacket, caught between childhood and adulthood in Rebel Without a Cause. Maria, singing on a fire escape in West Side Story. For over 3 decades, She had been part of our cultural fabric, growing up before our eyes on the silver screen. But Natalie Wood wasn't just another Hollywood actress. She represented something rare in the entertainment industry: genuine staying power. Child stars usually fade, their careers casualties of growing up in the public eye. Natalie defied that trajectory. She transitioned from child actress to adult star with a grace that seemed almost impossible, maintaining relevance across generations. By 1981, at 43 years old, she had proven herself time and again, earning 3 Academy Award nominations and countless other accolades. Her personal life seemed equally charmed. After a tumultuous first marriage to Robert Wagner, a divorce, and a subsequent marriage to British producer Richard Gregson, she and Wagner had found their way back to each other in 1972. Their remarriage was seen as a Hollywood fairy tale, proof that true love could survive even in the harsh spotlight of fame. They had 2 daughters, a beautiful home, and by all outward appearances, a life that many could only dream about. The couple had become Hollywood fixtures, attending premieres and industry events, representing a certain ideal of success and stability. In an industry known for broken relationships and fleeting connections, their reunion seemed to offer hope that some love stories could have second chances. Friends described them as devoted to each other and to their family, committed to making their second attempt at marriage work. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect existence, there were currents that few outside their inner circle could see. Natalie had long harbored a deep, almost primal fear of water. This wasn't a casual dislike or mild anxiety. It was visceral, rooted somewhere deep in her psyche. Some traced it back to her mother, who had consulted a fortune teller when Natalie was a child. The fortune teller allegedly warned that Natalie would die in dark water. Whether this prediction planted the seed of fear or simply confirmed an existing dread, no one could say for certain. What was clear was that Natalie avoided water whenever possible, rarely swam, and grew nervous around deep, dark expanses of ocean. Which makes what happened on Thanksgiving weekend 1981 all the more perplexing. Segment 10. The Thanksgiving Voyage. The plan for Thanksgiving weekend seemed simple enough. Robert Wagner, known to friends and colleagues as RJ, suggested a getaway on their yacht, the Splendor. It was a 58-foot vessel, comfortable and well-appointed, the kind of luxury that came with their status. Joining them would be Christopher Walken, Natalie's co-star in the film Brainstorm, which they had been working on together. Brainstorm was an important project for Natalie. After taking time off to focus on her family, she had returned to acting with renewed energy. The science fiction thriller represented her comeback, and she was invested in its success. Christopher Walken, an Oscar winner for The Deer Hunter, brought his own intensity to the production. The two had developed a friendly working relationship during filming. On Friday, November 27th, the trio set out from Marina del Rey, heading toward Catalina Island. The yacht's captain, Dennis Davon, handled the navigation. Davon was a young man who had worked for the Wagners for some time, familiar with both the vessel and the couple's dynamics. He knew the waters around Catalina well, had made the crossing many times. The crossing was smooth, and by Friday evening they had docked at Catalina's Isthmus Cove. The cove was a popular anchorage, sheltered and scenic, frequented by weekend sailors and yacht owners seeking a peaceful getaway. Other boats were moored nearby, their occupants similarly escaping the mainland for a few days of relaxation. It was the kind of setting that promised tranquility and escape from the demands of everyday life. That first night passed without incident. They had dinner at Doug's Harbour Reef, a restaurant popular with the boating crowd. Witnesses later recalled seeing them, noting nothing unusual about their demeanour. They seemed like any other group of successful people enjoying a holiday weekend away from the pressures of their work. Saturday brought more of the same. They explored the island, enjoyed the scenery, and returned to the yacht. But Saturday night was when the atmosphere began to shift. Again, they went to Doug's Harbour Reef for dinner. This time, however, the mood was different. Wagner and Walken engaged in a discussion that grew increasingly heated. The exact content of their conversation remains debated, but multiple witnesses noted the tension between the two men. Some accounts suggest they were arguing about Natalie's career, with Walken encouraging her to focus more on her work and Wagner preferring that she prioritize family. Others hint at jealousy, a suggestion that perhaps Wagner felt threatened by the close working relationship between his wife and her co-star. Whatever the specific trigger, by the time they returned to the Splendor that night, the convivial holiday atmosphere had evaporated. Back on the yacht, the tension that had been building would reach a breaking point. Segment 9. A Night of Broken Glass. The scene that unfolded on the Splendor after they returned from dinner has been recounted in various ways over the years, with details shifting as witnesses revised their stories or new information emerged. What seems consistent is that the argument between Wagner and Walken continued aboard the yacht. The discussion had moved from the restaurant to the more confined, intimate space of the vessel. Captain Dennis Davon, who was present that night, later described hearing the argument escalate. According to his account, Wagner and Walken were in the salon, their voices rising. Then came the sound of glass breaking. Wagner had apparently smashed a wine bottle in a moment of anger. The specifics of what was said vary depending on which version of events you read, but the intensity of the moment was undeniable. Natalie, caught in the middle of this confrontation between her husband and her co-star, retreated to her stateroom. The argument eventually subsided. Walken went to his own cabin. Wagner remained on deck for a time. Then he too went below. Sometime around 11 p.m., according to the timeline that would later be established, Wagner said he discovered that Natalie was not in their stateroom. He also noticed that the yacht's small dinghy, a 13-foot inflatable boat called a Zodiac, was missing. The dinghy had been tied to the stern of the Splendor. Wagner's account, as he would later tell it, was that he assumed Natalie had gone ashore, or perhaps was securing the dinghy, which had been banging against the hull. He stated that he didn't immediately raise an alarm because he thought she would return shortly. It wasn't until some time had passed that he became concerned and alerted Captain Davon that Natalie was missing. The exact timing of when Wagner realized Natalie was gone, when he began searching for her, and when authorities were notified would become crucial details in the investigation. Initial reports suggested the Coast Guard was called around 1:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, November 29th. Hours had elapsed between when Natalie was last seen and when a search began. By then, in the cold, dark waters of the Pacific, those hours had already sealed her fate. Segment 8. The Discovery. Dawn broke over Catalina Island on November 29th, 1981. Revealing a scene that would shock the world. The morning started like any other for those anchored in the cove. Boaters woke to another beautiful California day, the sun climbing over the water, boats bobbing gently at their moorings. Then came the search boats, the Coast Guard vessels cutting through the calm waters, the helicopter overhead. At approximately 8 a.m., Natalie Wood's body was found floating in the water about a mile away from the Splendor, near Blue Cavern Point. She was wearing a nightgown, socks, and a down jacket. The jacket, heavy when wet, appeared to have weighed her down rather than providing buoyancy. The Zodiac dinghy was found nearby, beached on the shore. Its key was in the off position. There was no evidence that its motor had been running when Natalie entered the water. This detail would become one of many puzzling aspects of the case. If she had taken the dinghy out, why hadn't she started the engine? If she had been trying to board it from the yacht, how did it end up so far away? The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office conducted an autopsy. Dr. Thomas Noguchi, who had examined numerous high-profile cases, including Marilyn Monroe and Robert F. Kennedy, performed the examination. His findings noted bruises on Natalie's body, including on her arms, legs, and face. There was a scratch on her throat. She had abrasions on her face and a bump on her head. The official cause of death was determined to be drowning, with hypothermia listed as a contributing factor. Her blood alcohol level was 0.14%, above the legal limit for driving. Traces of motion sickness medication and a painkiller were also found in her system. The coroner ruled the death an accidental drowning. The initial theory, as presented by investigators and accepted by the media, was straightforward. Natalie, possibly hearing the dinghy banging against the yacht's hull, had gone to secure it. Perhaps influenced by the alcohol and medication in her system, she had slipped and fallen into the water. Unable to get back aboard and hampered by her heavy jacket, she had succumbed to the cold water. It was a tragic accident, the official story went. A terrible confluence of circumstances that had taken a beloved star far too soon. The nation mourned. News of her death dominated headlines across the country. Television networks interrupted regular programming to report the tragedy. Fans gathered outside her home, leaving flowers and notes. The entertainment industry went into collective shock. Her funeral was held at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery, attended by hundreds of mourners from the entertainment industry and beyond. Notable figures from Hollywood's golden age joined younger stars in paying their respects. The world said goodbye to Natalie Wood, and the case was closed. But even as the casket was lowered into the ground, questions were already beginning to surface. Segment 7. The Unanswered Questions. In the immediate aftermath of Natalie's death, the three men who had been aboard the Splendor that night gave statements to investigators. Their accounts aligned in broad strokes, but differed in crucial details. Robert Wagner described the evening as tense, but not violent. Christopher Walken, who left the island shortly after the body was discovered, largely remained silent about the specifics of that night. Dennis Davin provided his version of events, which at the time supported the accidental drowning theory. But as the years passed, inconsistencies began to emerge. People who had been at Doug's Harbor Reef that Saturday night came forward with their observations. Some noted that the argument between Wagner and Walken had been more intense than initially reported. Others mentioned that Natalie had seemed upset when they left the restaurant. The timeline also drew scrutiny. Why had several hours elapsed between when Natalie was last seen and when the Coast Guard was called? Wagner's explanation that he thought she had gone ashore or was securing the dinghy seemed insufficient to some. Wouldn't a husband be immediately concerned if his wife, who was terrified of water, had vanished from a boat in the middle of the night? There was also the matter of what people on nearby boats had heard. At least one witness claimed to have heard a woman's voice crying for help that night, saying something along the lines of asking someone to help her get back to the boat. These cries were allegedly heard around midnight, which would have been around the time Natalie entered the water. The witness accounts from other boaters in the cove that night added another layer to the mystery. One couple reported being awakened by what sounded like a woman calling out. They described the voice as distressed, pleading. At the time, they hadn't known what to make of it. Sound carries strangely over water, and it's often difficult to pinpoint exactly where it's coming from or how far away it is. They had listened for a few moments, heard nothing more, and eventually went back to sleep. If this testimony was accurate, why hadn't anyone on the Splendor heard her? Or if they had, why hadn't they responded? The scratches on her throat and the abrasions on her face also raised questions. Could these have been caused by something other than attempting to board a dinghy? The fingernail scratches on her throat, in particular, seemed unusual. Some speculated they could have been self-inflicted in panic, but others wondered if they suggested a struggle. Then, in 2008, nearly 3 decades after Natalie's death, Dennis Davin decided to break his silence. Segment 6. The Captain Speaks. Dennis Davin had lived with the secret of that night for 27 years. In 2008, he co-authored a book and began giving interviews, presenting a version of events that contradicted the official story he had told investigators in 1981. His new account painted a very different picture of what happened aboard the Splendor. The decision to come forward couldn't have been easy. Davin knew he would face skepticism, accusations of seeking attention or profit, and possible legal consequences for having potentially lied to investigators decades earlier. Yet he felt compelled to tell what he claimed was the truth, saying the burden of keeping the secret had become too much to bear. According to Davin's revised testimony, the argument between Wagner and Walken had been fierce, more intense than initially reported. He claimed that after they returned to the yacht, the confrontation continued, and that Wagner had been extremely upset about what he perceived as an inappropriate closeness between Walken and Natalie. More significantly, Davin stated that he and Wagner had heard Natalie calling for help from the water. He alleged that Wagner had prevented him from turning on the yacht's searchlights or immediately calling for help, saying they should wait to see if she would return. This claim, if true, would transform the incident from a tragic accident into something far more disturbing. Davin also suggested that he had been pressured to stay quiet in the original investigation, that Wagner's attorneys had coached him on what to say. He expressed remorse for not telling the truth earlier, saying that the guilt had weighed on him for years. These revelations sparked renewed interest in the case. True crime enthusiasts, journalists, and members of the public began re-examining the evidence. Natalie's sister, Lana Wood, had long harbored doubts about the official story. She had never believed the accidental drowning theory, feeling that crucial details didn't add up. Davin's statements seemed to validate her suspicions. Robert Wagner, through his representatives, disputed Davin's claims. He maintained that the original account was accurate, that Natalie's death had been a terrible accident, and that Davin was seeking attention or financial gain through his book. Wagner suggested that Davin's memory might be unreliable after so many years, or that he was fabricating details. Christopher Walken, who had remained largely silent about that night, issued a brief statement through his publicist reiterating that he had no additional information to provide beyond what he had told investigators in 1981. He had been asleep in his cabin, he maintained, and knew nothing about what happened until morning. The conflicting accounts prompted authorities to take another look at a case that had been closed for decades. Segment 5. The case reopened. In November 2011, 30 years after Natalie Wood's death, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department announced that it was reopening the investigation. This decision was based on new information that had come to light, including Davin's changed testimony and statements from additional witnesses who had been on boats near the Splendor that night. The decision to reopen a case after 3 decades was unusual. It signaled that investigators believed there were legitimate reasons to question the original conclusions. Cold case detectives, equipped with modern investigative techniques and a fresh perspective, began examining everything from scratch. Detectives began re-interviewing witnesses, reviewing old evidence, and examining details that had been overlooked or insufficiently explored in the original investigation. They spoke with people who had been on nearby boats, restaurant staff who had served the group that weekend, and anyone who might have observed something relevant. Each conversation revealed small details that, when pieced together, began to form a more complete picture of that night. They looked at the bruises on Natalie's body with fresh eyes, consulting with forensic experts to determine whether the injuries were consistent with an accidental fall or suggested something more sinister. Forensic pathologists examined photographs from the autopsy, analyzing the pattern and severity of the bruising. Their conclusions raised more questions than they answered. In 2012, the coroner's office amended Natalie's death certificate. The cause of death remained drowning, but the manner of death was changed from accident to undetermined. This subtle but significant change reflected the renewed uncertainty about what exactly had happened that night. An undetermined manner of death meant that authorities could not definitively say whether Natalie's drowning was accidental, the result of wrongdoing, or something else entirely. The amended report also noted that the bruises on Natalie's arms, wrist, knee, and ankle were more numerous and extensive than would be expected from someone simply trying to board a dinghy. The coroner's office stated that the bruises could have occurred before Natalie entered the water, raising the possibility that there had been some kind of physical altercation aboard the yacht. Investigators also focused on the timeline, trying to establish more precisely when Natalie entered the water and when help was called. Witnesses on other boats provided statements about what they had heard that night. One couple who had been on a nearby vessel reported hearing a woman's voice around midnight, calling out for help. They said the voice sounded like someone struggling in the water, asking for assistance getting back to a boat. If these witnesses were correct, it meant that Natalie had been in the water, alive and calling for help, for potentially over an hour before any rescue efforts began. The question of why no one from the Splendor had responded to her cries became even more troubling. In 2018, Robert Wagner was named a person of interest in the investigation. This designation didn't mean he was a suspect or that charges were imminent, but it indicated that investigators believed he had information relevant to the case that he had not fully disclosed. Wagner, through his attorney, declined to speak with detectives about the renewed investigation. As investigators dug deeper, a more complex picture of that night began to emerge. Segment 4. The theory takes shape. Based on the renewed investigation, witness statements, and expert analysis, a theory developed about what might have happened aboard the Splendor. This theory, while not proven and still contested by some, attempted to reconcile the various pieces of evidence and witness accounts. According to this reconstruction, the argument between Wagner and Walken had indeed been intense, centered around Natalie's career and possibly Wagner's jealousy about her professional relationship with Walken. When they returned to the yacht, the confrontation continued. At some point, Natalie intervened or became the focus of Wagner's anger. The theory suggests that there may have been a physical altercation which would explain the bruises on Natalie's body. Whether this confrontation was between Wagner and Natalie, or whether Natalie was injured while trying to separate the two men, remains unclear. What seems possible is that the argument escalated beyond words. Natalie, upset and possibly frightened, may have retreated to the rear deck of the yacht. Perhaps she was considering taking the dinghy to shore, wanting to escape the tense situation. Perhaps she was simply trying to get away from the argument. The rear deck would have been dark, the water below invisible in the November night. The yacht would have been rocking gently with the waves, making footing uncertain. At some point, she ended up in the water. Whether she fell, jumped, or was somehow knocked into the water is the crucial unknown. If she had been attempting to board or secure the dinghy, as the original theory suggested, she might have lost her balance. The combination of alcohol, medication, darkness, and the movement of the boat could have made it easy to slip. Or perhaps, in her distressed state, she misjudged the distance or her own capabilities. The heavy down jacket she was wearing would have quickly become waterlogged, making it difficult to swim. Combined with the cold temperature of the water and possibly the disorienting effects of alcohol and medication, she would have struggled to save herself. The most disturbing aspect of this theory is the allegation that she was heard calling for help, but that Wagner delayed calling the Coast Guard. If Daven's later account is accurate, and Wagner did indeed hear Natalie's cries but chose not to immediately respond, the question becomes why? Was it panic, not knowing what to do? Was it anger, a belief that she was being dramatic and would get herself to shore? Or was there a more calculated reason? By the time help was called, it may have been too late. This theory has its supporters and its detractors. Those who believe it point to the changed testimonies, the witness accounts of hearing cries for help, and the extensive bruising on Natalie's body. Those who dispute it argue that memories can be unreliable after decades, that Daven may have reasons to fabricate or exaggerate, and that the evidence is still consistent with an accidental drowning. What remains indisputable is that the full truth of that night has never been definitively established. Segment 3. The Legacy of Unanswered Questions. Robert Wagner has continued to maintain his innocence and has never been charged with any crime related to Natalie Wood's death. He has stated repeatedly that he loved Natalie and that her death was a tragic accident that has haunted him for the rest of his life. In his memoir, published years after the incident, he devoted considerable space to that Thanksgiving weekend, expressing his grief and maintaining that he had nothing to hide. Christopher Walken has remained on the periphery of the controversy. He left the island immediately after Natalie's body was discovered and has consistently stated that he was asleep in his cabin and knows nothing beyond what he told police in 1981. He has expressed sympathy for Natalie's family and sadness over her death, but has not provided any additional insights into the argument or the events of that night. Dennis Daven's changing story has made him a controversial figure. Some see him as a man finally unburdening his conscience after years of living with a terrible secret. Others view him as an opportunist who altered his testimony for financial gain or attention. The truth of his motivations may be as complex and murky as the case itself. For Natalie's daughters, Natasha Gregson Wagner and Courtney Wagner, the renewed investigation has meant reliving their mother's death over and over again in the public eye. Natasha, who was 11 when her mother died, has spoken about the difficulty of not knowing exactly what happened, of having to read speculation and theories about her mother's final moments. She has expressed a desire for closure while acknowledging that it may never come. The case remains officially open. Detectives continue to investigate, though the passage of time has made their job increasingly difficult. Witnesses' memories fade, evidence degrades, and the key players are aging. Wagner is now in his 90s. Any definitive resolution seems increasingly unlikely as years turn into decades. Perhaps what's most haunting about Natalie Wood's death is how it reflects the dark undercurrents that can exist beneath even the most glamorous surfaces. Segment 2. The Woman Behind the Mystery. In the decades of speculation and investigation, it's sometimes easy to lose sight of Natalie Wood herself. She was more than a mystery to be solved, more than a collection of evidence and witness statements. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother, a friend, and an artist who brought joy to millions through her performances. Born Natalia Zakharenko to Russian immigrant parents in San Francisco in 1938, she had been in front of cameras since she was 4 years old. Her childhood was consumed by the demands of Hollywood, managed by a stage mother who saw stardom as the family's ticket to a better life. the pressures of child stardom, the loss of a normal childhood, the constant scrutiny. These shaped who Natalie became. Her early roles captivated audiences in ways few child actors could manage. She had a natural quality on screen, an ability to convey emotion that seemed beyond her years. When she appeared in Miracle on 34th Street at age 8, she brought an authenticity to the role of Susan Walker that made the film's magic feel real. Directors recognized her talent immediately, and the roles kept coming. The transition years could have ended her career. Many child stars found themselves unable to adapt when they outgrew their cute factor. Natalie faced this challenge head-on, taking roles that showcased her maturity and range. Rebel Without a Cause, released when she was just 17, proved she could hold her own alongside established stars like James Dean. Her performance earned her a Best Supporting Actress nomination, a remarkable achievement for someone so young. As an adult, she worked to balance her career with her desire for a private life and a family. She took breaks from acting to focus on her children, returning when projects interested her. She was known for her professionalism, her warmth toward crew members, and her genuine talent. Directors praised her emotional depth and her ability to convey complex feelings with subtle expressions. Natalie's career had spanned genres and decades, from musicals to dramas to comedies. She had worked with some of the greatest directors in cinema history. She had been nominated for Academy Awards as both a child and an adult. Few performers could claim such longevity and versatility. Her roles showcased remarkable range. She could be vulnerable and strong, innocent and worldly, tragic and comedic. In Splendor in the Grass, she brought heartbreaking depth to a young woman caught between desire and societal expectations. In Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, she showed her gift for comedy. Each performance revealed new facets of her talent, proving she was far more than just a beautiful face on screen. At the time of her death, she was poised for a career resurgence with Brainstorm, ready to prove that she could still captivate audiences. The film was released in 1983, 2 years after her death, completed using special effects and a body double for her remaining scenes. Watching it now, seeing her performance knowing what would happen, adds a layer of tragedy to every frame. There's a scene where her character discusses the nature of death, which takes on an eerie prescience given what occurred. In the end, perhaps the greatest tragedy is that Natalie Wood's death has overshadowed her life. Segment 1. Reflections on an Unsolved Mystery. The death of Natalie Wood stands as one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries, a case that refuses to be neatly resolved. It represents something larger than just the loss of a single life, tragic though that was. It speaks to the darkness that can lurk behind the glamorous facade of celebrity, the ways that fame and fortune cannot protect against human frailty, jealousy, anger, or the simple randomness of accident. Over 4 decades have passed since that Thanksgiving weekend in 1981. Generations have come of age who never saw Natalie Wood on screen during her lifetime, who know her only as a figure in old movies and an unsolved mystery. Yet interest in the case persists. New theories emerge, old evidence is re-examined, and the debate continues. Part of what makes the case so compelling is its fundamental ambiguity. Unlike some mysteries where there's clear evidence of wrongdoing but the perpetrator remains unknown, the Natalie Wood case exists in a space where we cannot even be certain that a crime occurred. Was it murder? Was it manslaughter? Was it simply a terrible accident? The evidence can be interpreted to support any of these conclusions. The case has become a touchstone for discussions about how celebrity, wealth, and power can influence justice. It raises uncomfortable questions about whether the same investigation would have been conducted differently if the people involved had been ordinary citizens rather than Hollywood royalty. Would the initial inquiry have been more thorough? Would witnesses have been pressed harder? Would the delay in calling for help have been scrutinized more aggressively? These questions extend beyond just this case. They speak to larger issues of privilege and accountability, of how the famous and powerful navigate systems that others cannot. The fact that it took 30 years for the case to be reopened, only after public pressure and changed testimonies forced the issue, suggests that the initial investigation may indeed have been influenced by the status of those involved. This ambiguity leaves room for endless speculation and ensures that the case remains alive in the public consciousness. Every few years, when investigators announce a new development or a witness comes forward with additional information, the story resurfaces in headlines and the cycle of questions begins again. For those who knew Natalie personally, this perpetual resurrection of the case brings both pain and, perhaps, a measure of hope. Pain because it means never being able to fully grieve and move on, always being brought back to that terrible night. Hope because it means the search for truth hasn't been abandoned, that someone might still come forward with information that finally resolves the mystery. The technological advances in forensic science since 1981 offer some possibility that modern methods could shed new light on old evidence. DNA analysis, improved understanding of drowning patterns, better ability to analyze injury patterns. These tools weren't available or weren't as sophisticated when Natalie died. Yet as time passes, the physical evidence deteriorates, making it uncertain whether even modern science could provide definitive answers at this point. There's also the question of what justice would look like in a case like this. If it were proven that Natalie's death was not an accident, if it were established that someone bore responsibility for her entering the water or for delaying rescue efforts, what then? The perpetrator would be elderly, the events decades in the past. Legal statutes and practical considerations would complicate any prosecution. Would the truth alone be enough? For some, the quest isn't really about legal justice, but about historical truth. They want to know what happened, to have the record set straight, to ensure that Natalie Wood's story is told accurately. Whether anyone is punished matters less than establishing the facts. The case has also become a cautionary tale about how investigations can be shaped by the fame and power of those involved. In 1981, Robert Wagner was a major star, well-connected and well-respected. Some critics of the original investigation have suggested that this influenced how aggressively detectives pursued certain lines of inquiry, how willing they were to accept the accounts provided by those on the yacht. The reopening of the case decades later could be seen as an acknowledgement that the initial investigation may have been insufficient. The truth is that we may never know with certainty what happened during those crucial hours aboard the Splendor. The primary witnesses have given conflicting accounts. The physical evidence can be interpreted multiple ways, without a dramatic breakthrough, a deathbed confession, a previously unknown witness, some piece of evidence that definitively resolves the ambiguity. The case may remain forever in this state of unresolved tension. What we're left with is a story that asks us to grapple with uncertainty, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. In an age where we're accustomed to having answers at our fingertips, where every question can be researched and every mystery can be solved with enough data, the Natalie Wood case reminds us that some things resist resolution, some questions endure, and perhaps that's fitting for a woman who spent her life in front of cameras, creating stories and inhabiting characters. Her final chapter remains unwritten, the ending still unknown. Natalie Wood remains, as she was in life, captivating and elusive, a presence that continues to draw us in even as the full truth slips away into the dark water. The yacht Splendor was eventually sold and renamed. It changed hands several times over the years. Catalina Island remains a popular destination for boaters. The restaurant where Wagner, Wood, and Walken had their final dinner together still operates. Life continues, as it always does, flowing around the gaps left by tragedy. But on certain November nights, when the water is dark and the wind is cold, it's impossible not to think of a woman in a nightgown and a heavy jacket, alone in the ocean, calling out for help that may or may not have come in time. It's impossible not to wonder about the fear she must have felt, the cold, the desperate hope that someone would hear her and come to her aid. Natalie Wood's death remains a wound that hasn't healed, a question without an answer, a mystery that endures. And perhaps in a strange way, that endurance is its own kind of memorial, ensuring that she is not forgotten, that her story continues to be told, that the search for truth continues even when truth itself seems impossibly distant. What happened to Natalie Wood on that Thanksgiving weekend in 1981? We may never know the complete truth, but we can remember her not just as a mystery, but as a person. Talented, complex. A star whose light was extinguished far too soon, leaving questions that echo across the decades. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.